I'm a Justa here speaking about AIDS orphans in Tanzania. We've had Oliver Stone talk about trying to get progressive movies in Hollywood. Abby Lewis talking about workers taking the factories back in Argentina. Colleen Rajoette, filmmaker from Winnipeg Aboriginal Films. We've had Helen Collicott talk about uranium mining here in Saskatchewan. Wendy Mesley about you can't look to the news to get real news. We've had Ralph Nader. We've had Robert Trivers talking about deception and warfare. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have Seymour Hersh here talking about from September 11th through Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. But tonight is a very special speaker because it speaks to us here in Saskatchewan. And I don't want to do the introduction for that. Rather, we've had someone graciously consent to do the formal introduction of Mr. Churchill. So I'd like to introduce to you tonight Dr. Shawneen Pete. She's the Academic Vice President of First Nations University of Canada, who has graciously consented to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Pete.
It's nice to see all of you here this evening. We hear the name Ward Churchill, and I'm sure that people have a variety of responses and curiosities that come with it, and I think this is such a fantastic opportunity for all of us in our community, not only the students, but broader into Regina and beyond. We have guests here who've traveled some ways to join us here tonight, and I think this is just a fantastic evening. I was asked when I was away last week, and I received a text message, because we do things that way these days. And I was asked if I would help to set the context and also introduce Ward as well. And so part of this evening will be a little bit of background to help situate partly why we're having this conversation today and why we've asked Ward to attend. I wanted to start off simply with a story, and I think it's a good way to start the evening off. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm a little bit nervous tonight. It's been a real busy day. Just take a deep breath for me, will you? Thank you for that. A long time ago, education for Indigenous people was difficult at best to gain. My grandmother's name is Myra. And in the late 30s, we had a system in place of passes and permits that determined whether Indian people could leave the reserve, whether they could sell their produce, and all of those kinds of things. And in the late 30s, my grandmother was a teenager, and she had just completed her residential schooling and was not satisfied with the quality of education that she had, nor the very low expectations that that system had for how she was going to contribute. She asked for permission from the Indian agent to leave the reserve and to go to another community so that she could become a teacher. And she was a teenager. There was another woman from our reserve who asked to leave as well, and Liza and Myra left as teenage girls to travel away to learn to be teachers. And the kinds of negotiations that were needed in order to acquire the pass were lengthy, and they both achieved that pass in order to leave. Their vision was that they wanted to be able to create a school in our community at Little Pine. They wanted to be able to educate their own children when they came, and they also wanted to make sure that those children didn't have such limited outcomes or limited expectations for how they would contribute in society. And so a small school was started in the basement of the church at the reserve. Those brave moves that those young teenagers made and the resulting contributions have forever changed, I think, the way that Indigenous education in this province has evolved, and we have inherited that. Amongst her own children, whence they came, there were 12 of them in a row, 10 survived. 8 of them have gone on to some form of post-secondary training. My father was accepted here in this university in 1970. I understand that at that time, prior to that time, if he had attended, he would have lost his treaty status. And in 1970, both he and my mother came to this campus. I was 5, do the math. And, my mom started upstairs in this building, and I played in the foyer area, in the pit, with my brother and sister while my mom was in classes. And I watched them for an hour, 3 times a week, while my mom studied, because they had inherited the right and the ability to go to university. Through the course of their time in schooling, and since we've inherited this right and now we can act upon it, we've seen some changes in the province to the way that our education system has evolved. Over 30 years ago, the dream of the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College resulted in the creation of a small trailer on this campus. Ida Wasakase was here. She called her sister, Laura Wasakase, who was living in Winnipeg, and she said to Laura, "Would you mind coming for a visit? I'd like to talk to you about something we're doing over here." And so Laura showed up with her suitcases, and Ida fooled her. She said, "Laura, look at these wonderful students that I have here." There were about 7 or 8 of them in the backyard at Ida's house. And Laura was introduced to all of them. And Ida said, "You know, they really need a student counselor. They'd really need someone to work with them." And Laura looked at her sister and she said, "You're up to it again, aren't you? You're going to keep me here and I'll never go back to Winnipeg." And in fact, that's partly what happened. Laura ended up being here, providing those services to her sister and that first handful of students here on this campus at that time. So at the same time that we were creating university programs here, there were other things happening in the province. The Indian Teacher Education Program started up, the SUNTEP program, the NORTEP program, and some of those Indigenous-specific programs started to come into fruition. In the mid-70s, there was a Native Law program that was starting up in Saskatoon, and my dad applied and was one of those first students to go to that program. And so we left Regina and we moved to follow him so he could study, like so many other families were doing at that time, seeking something better for themselves, seeking a greater opportunity for their own children. These programs grew up in isolation in the province, and it's not that the only focus should be on them, because they were doing really good work, but there was something else happening in the mainstream programs, and mostly it was absence. We were still trying to insert our perspectives and ways of knowing and histories into mainstream institutions. And in the segregated forms that we were evolving, oftentimes mainstream looked at us and thought, they're not as good as us, they're not the same as us, they are watered down programs, their Mickey Mouse programs were the kind of discourse norms of the day that were happening, and sometimes my students tell me still happen today. Mainstream needed to catch up too, and they started to support departments of Indigenous studies or Native studies, both at the U of S in particular, and here through SIFC. Those programs provided a different kind of knowledge base, but it was just a fraction of what was taught on the larger campuses. And so over time, we had fractured, isolated, and in some cases additive curriculum about Indigenous peoples. And what we've inherited to date is programs that are still structured similarly. Okay. I was a faculty member both at the U of S and at the U of R, and now I'm working at First Nations University, and that's a job I sought out for 7 years. And I've wanted to be there. I chose to be there on purpose and by design. But my work in mainstream institutions has taught me a few things. I went away, did a PhD in higher education administration, which I think helps inform the work that I do today. But in my work as a faculty member, I couldn't get a job in higher education administration, because we really don't teach that in universities. So there's no faculty work there. So I ended up finding my first teaching positions in the academy in foundations, educational foundations, because there was an assumption as a First Nations woman I should be able to integrate feminist, multicultural, Indigenous knowledge perspectives, right? Even though I studied admin, okay? So I was lacking, right? You know, because admin doesn't really put those philosophies and foundations in the core of what they did at the day, right? So, you know, I got kind of a masculine mainstream education myself, and so I was limited in what I was being hired to do, and I had to play catch up. In working with my students, most of my students were mainstream, and I had them do an assignment, and one of the first assignments I had them do was tell me about how they learned about race, class, and gender in their home schools and communities. And I've taught 26, 27 sections of that class. I don't even know what the head count on that would be. You can do the math, 30 so people, 26, 27 classes, whatever it happens to be. And what my students taught me from these mainstream classes is that they were systematically denied the opportunity to learn about difference. They were given a curriculum from kindergarten to grade 12 that was very much geared at their comfort level. And so they didn't have a real wide range of knowing about racial difference, class difference, even gender differences. And many of my students would often say that as white women, they didn't ever feel oppressed, you know, until partway through my class and they realized how big it really was, and they just were blind to it. My students taught me a few other things. They were white, they were middle class, they grew up in communities of sameness, oftentimes in communities where people were related to them, especially if they were from small town Saskatchewan. You know, so their farm was here and their grandparents' farm was there and their cousins lived down the road, and they all got on the same bus and went to school in town with other people who were practically all related to each other too, right? And difference was denied them in their communities. They talked about how their students in their classrooms and in their schools didn't see racial difference very often. They talked about the Chinese family that ran the small town restaurant in their community. They talked about the black doctors who came in, but only for a time. And they talked about the First Nations and Métis foster children who lived in that house over there, but they were never around very long and we never made friends with them. And so within that school structure and in that community structure, teachers really interpreted that there was no need to talk about difference. There was no need to talk about our collective past. And so oftentimes those students came into the university setting with very little to no experiences working with Indigenous people. Oftentimes I was the first Indian they had to deal with on a regular basis, and I'm a little intimidating, you know, because I talk like this all the time. And that's going to scare white folks to a degree. And so it was challenging for them to learn a new way of knowing when different perspectives were brought into the curriculum. And oftentimes, when I storied through our collective past by sharing stories like my grandmother's story, by sharing stories about residential schooling and the effects that it's had in our communities, my white students, my white mainstream students, primarily female, increasingly more Christian, had no experience with it, had no very little foundation for recognizing the impacts that residential schooling have had in our population. And they were ill-equipped to respond to their emotional reactions to what they were learning. Oftentimes, their first response were, "No way! That happened here?" And I'd tell them about the Regina Indian Industrial School that used to operate in this community, and LeBret Student Residence, and Maryvale, and on and on and on through the valley, and where their locations were, all within driving distance to this place. And they were like, "Oh, I grew up here, nobody ever talked about it. How could that be? Why wouldn't somebody teach me that? Why wasn't that in the curriculum? How come I'm just learning that now?" And then they'd get ticked off, right? Because they're like, "Geez, you know, I'm 20, I never learned any of this." And then some of them would respond in minimization. "Oh, geez, you know, but that was so long ago. That couldn't affect people now." And then I'd remind them that the last residential school closed in, who knows, exactly, like just recently, like, you know, recently. And they didn't even know that. So those schools were actually still operating when they were students in schooling. And that was never discussed in their education either. And then they start to wonder, was I educated to be this ignorant? And then they were filled with grief and shame in some cases and anger. How dare they have taught me like this, to this level? And then they're, in some cases, overwhelmed that they only have 3 years left of university and wonder how they're going to cram enough knowing in to be able to be responsive to this increasingly diverse population in which they're going to work. And that's frightening to them. They want to know what we can do. How can we change things? How can I make things better? And how, as a white middle-class person who didn't know this before I came to your class, how can I play a role in creating some change? And is it my job to? And should I, if I'm this ignorant? Where can I learn more, they asked. And I talked with them about the resources that were out here, the individuals who know these stories, the readings that are available to them. Google Indian residential school and tell me you won't find some information on this. It's that simple now. The difficulty in this contemporary time is because we've grown up collectively as white and brown people in Saskatchewan without this base knowing, because there's First Nations and Métis students who may or may not have a whole lot of understanding about this either, right? Because we all collectively have been denied the opportunity to learn about this, many people in our communities, at the bank, at the coffee shop, over the newspaper in the morning in our first cup of coffee, may be asking themselves the question, why truth and reconciliation? Why are we doing this now? Shouldn't you people just get over it? I don't know how many times I've heard that one. And then we have to be prepared to respond to that in some educational kind of way, some meaningful way. And we have to be able to formulate some answers to what now? How can we make things better? We've made the invitation, or others have made the invitation on our collective behalf to try and fill some of the void on this knowing. And in doing so, a grand invitation has been extended toward Churchill. And when I first heard that he was going to be our guest here, I was like, holy shit, man, I read his stuff. Like, he's freaking famous, you know? And I was just really blown away, and I was like, cool, where's my books? You know, I got to go find them again and pull them out and read them and remember, oh yeah, I remember that, how that touched me, how excited I got when he said that, and I'd been saying it, but, you know, I'm dismissed oftentimes because, you know, I was a new faculty member. They don't always believe you, you know? And I'm, you know, and I'm brown and female, so that goes against me too. And so these things come into play, and I think this is such a fantastic opportunity for all of us. You say the words and say the name, word Churchill, and a variety of people have a variety of responses in so many ways. Isn't he the guy that, was he the one? Did he? Is he? And those types of questions come up. And I'm sure that you too have done some of your research and some of your checking into it, and you've picked up some pieces along the way too. But I don't think anything will really touch the experience of hearing the man speak. And with that, word Churchill. Thank you.
Sio, Osiju. Hello, my relatives. Good to see you here. I almost feel like I should go to questions after the introduction. Whoa. Truth and reconciliation. Truth is one thing. Reconciliation is something else entirely. I would suggest first that without the truth, you can't have the reconciliation. And we're a long way from the truth, but the two have been joined, fused, if you will, in almost propagandistic fashion to the point where it comes out as all one word, truth and reconciliation. Kind of like some other fusions that I've encountered in my life. Innocent Americans, for example. all one word. Maybe we've been playing with computers too much here, but I thought innocent was a qualification that had to be earned, and you didn't have it by virtue of some national identity. Got the largest incarcerated population in real numbers of any country on the planet down there, proportionately. Even worse, and somehow or another translate, if you're American, you're innocent. It's nonsensical, and I would suggest that truth and reconciliation might be in and of themselves as well. Were truth to be achieved, were truth to be cognated, internalized, acted upon, there would be a basis for reconciliation, and in individual senses, quite often that's the case. People, that is individuals or small groups of people, communities as it were, can reconcile within themselves, but in a way that's fundamentally separate from this sort of superficial blather of the dominant society, which is primarily the promoter of the idea of the truth and reconciliation process in Canada, but it extends to the United States as well. I had kind of a formative experience with this idea when I was asked to serve on a tribunal on the rights of indigenous Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli is what they call themselves. Their territory is the Hawaiian archipelago. Not some of it, all of it. And in 1993, the Congress of the United States, that is both the House of Representatives and the Senate, voted overwhelmingly to issue an apology to the Kanaka Valley, although they called them Native Hawaiians, for having overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy 100 years earlier. This was on the 100th anniversary. Bill Clinton signed it, and there was a little ceremony about it and so forth. We're sorry. We're sorry. We're so sorry we do nothing beyond say we're sorry. Not a single golf course was turned back into taro. Not a single hotel was converted into housing for Hawaiians who end up dispossessed of their land and destitute and sleeping on the beach when the beach patrol is not coming along and driving them off that, because after all, tourism is the major industry, and who wants to see a bunch of Hawaiians sleeping on the picnic tables? Not a dime of compensation was paid, but compensation is not really at issue, because compensation is what happens when somebody wants to alienate something. It really kind of requires consent. I mean, I don't come over like your car, grab the keys off your table, throw you what I think I might be able to spare out of my wallet and thereby own your car. Now do I? That's compensation for the loss of your car. Absent your consent, that really actually isn't compensation. It's trying to put some sort of an obfuscatory, as academics would say, gloss over the theft of your car. The United States apologized for what it acknowledged in black letter print was the illegal act of utilizing its military force to support a group of interlopers who had migrated to Hawaii in the 1870s and 1880s to overthrow the legitimate government of the Hawaiian Islands, recognized in 3 separate treaties by the United States, a crime against the law of nations. How does this work down there in that nation of laws, as the United States refers to itself? And I think there's some echoes in Canadian courts up here too about Canada being a nation of laws, government of laws, not men. Law enforcement's a big issue always, and the conservatives in power, whether north of the border or south, and what, by the way, is that border besides a line somebody else drew across our territory to separate us one from the other and turn us into nationals of 2 entities which have nothing to do with indigenous tradition whatsoever. But with conservatives in power, we have all this babble about law enforcement. Well, what would the law say when you admit to an illegal act? They call that a confession. It's actionable. Now, the people literally who engaged in the illegality, the criminal act, no longer are alive. They're not prosecutable. And that takes it kind of out of the criminal judicial dimension and places it in civil dimension insofar as there are material damages that can be assessed. And given that there's the recognition bilaterally of the sovereignty of the Hawaiian monarchy, and thus the vestiture of sovereignty in the Hawaiian people. Understand it doesn't come from there, but this is U.S. recognition that it exists. That's a legal definition of standing of the two parties. Meaning, insofar as you have the recognition that this is another country, you're dealing with international law. And this would be placed, insofar as it's civil at this point, in the arena of international tort action. What would tort action say? This has bearing for people here too, and has bearing on truth. It has bearing on truth. Tort action says there's 3 levels of redress that are automatically triggered by the agreement of the parties that a criminal act has been committed. Those who have been victimized by that act have recourse at 3 levels. Let's say, for example, they took your property. Theft. Now, theft has all sorts of implications when the property happens to be the real property, referred to usually in terms of being a homeland. First is restitution. It's not compensation. What does restitution mean? A restitution goes like this. Does the property that was unlawfully taken from the victimized person or group still exist? If it still exists, it can be returned. That's what restitution is. If it was wrongfully, illegally, unlawfully taken, the victim has automatically the right to recover. If the RCMP grabs the guy who stole your car 50 kilometers up the road, recovers the car, you recover it from the RCMP. That's a law. It may require a court appearance and a judicial decree, but you get your property back. From that, you go to the consideration of, in the process of trying to outrun the RCMP, did the thief put the car in a ditch, thus damage it? If so, you not only have restitution, but you're entitled to reparation. That means they repair the car if damage was done to the property taken and it is recovered. That's the reparation end of things. And only if it's unrepairable does compensation kick in. Now that's in whole or in part. It may be that your property, your vehicle, to use the illustration that I'm using, can be partly repaired, but it can never be restored to the condition in which it was taken in the first place. So you have reparation to the extent that it's possible and compensation for that which cannot be repaired. Okay, we're going to have truth and reconciliation. Well, truth is, Canada is stolen land by and large. By and large. The non-native population, by and large, is engaged in an illegal occupation, extracting use and benefit of somebody else's property, creating a way of life to which it is decided it is entitled, irrespective of the effects upon those from whom the basis of that way of life was taken. I look to the numbered treaties, I look to the older treaties, I see what the treaty territories are, and I look at the reserves. And there's a big difference between the two. Leaving out the elements of coercion and fraud that enter into the treaty-making process, thus invalidating them, and invalidating the treaties between the government of Canada, or in Canada's case, the Crown, and the indigenous peoples, by virtue of coercion or fraud, you invalidate the land title or even a pretense to it. But even setting those two considerations to the side, what was agreed to by indigenous ancestors in these treaty compacts that would allow some pretense of a legal basis of existence for the state of Canada. The difference between what was retained in treaty law and guaranteed by the Crown and consequently guaranteed by Canada insofar as those Crown treaties are the only territorial basis of existence. Canada would like to disavow them. Well, you got a problem with a violation of it, go talk to the Crown. No, it's not the Crown that's basing its existence on the treaties, it's you, Ottawa. And if you don't want to comply with the treaties, then you got no legal title, and by obligation of law, if you're a nation of laws, you need to unass the territory, as they say in Hollywood, or start paying rent and place yourself under native jurisdiction. That would be something true. And if the settler population, and that's what it is, it's an immigrant population, and got a lot of problems now with immigration policy, but let's remember, if you're not indigenous here, if you're not Aboriginal person, you are a descendant of immigrants. You are an immigrant population. You are a settler population. You're never going to be non-settler until you have this reconciliation with the indigenous on terms acceptable to the indigenous, because after all, it was indigenous land. That's the deal. You don't come in and announce you've got a superior use for the property of another and therefore are entitled to dispossess them and put it to the use. Why? How do we know it was a superior use? Because they said so. They may even have believed it, but I don't care. I come to your living room for the first time tonight. I may have a decorating scheme that's radically different than yours, and I might want to have my friends over, and we could house more people in your house, and I consider that by my value scheme to be a better use than you're putting it to. I'm not sure you're going to agree that that's a reasonable application of legal principle here, that somehow or another, by virtue of my insistence that I know better how to make disposition of your property than you do, that I own it. And you can press claims against me for some restoration of use. Maybe I'll allow you a closet to set up shop in. But on the other hand, if I got a use for the closet that I deem superior than housing yourself, out the back window you may go and giddy up down the street. To where? We're not too big on homeless in this advanced society, are we? No. Truth is masked. Truth is hidden. Truth is denied. Because this process didn't happen by some sort of Century 21 real estate speculative deal with subprime mortgages or something. It wasn't that native people were just conned out of their property because they're too dumb to keep up with the slippery language of the interlopers, the settlers, those with the self-proclaimed superior way of doing business and laws. But definitions in reality end up getting distorted. That's what hides the fact that there's an inconsistency with the rule of law that's absolutely fundamental to the maintenance of the order of society as we encounter it, the nature of the economy, and certainly the territorial corpus of what's claimed rightfully as the mega state of Canada, as opposed to it really gets confusing when you go south of that magic line, because you got the United States, except they ought to be provinces because the state is the central government. Little conflation here that's gone on between nation and state, to the point where now you have this monstrosity out there that everybody accepts as being reasonable, the idea of the nation state. Well, how can you have a nation with 400 treated subparts of itself as there are south of the border? How did that vast plurality become a singularity? A state's a form of government, way of organizing the governing apparatus to encompass the interests of whatever is within its claimed boundaries. Often a multiplicity of nations, all held to the same rule by force, all held to the same arbitrary rule by force. Well, it's arbitrary only in the sense that it doesn't really reflect anybody's interest other than those in charge, but that's another story. The United Nations, as they call it, in which you have to be a recognized state to be a member, should have been called the United States. But of course the name was already taken. Go figure. So when we're talking about nations, look, every indigenous people insofar as it has a treaty relationship with the central government, is recognized legally, formally, as being another nation. Nations are one thing, states are another. I know of no indigenous people, no indigenous nation that ever organized itself in the form of the state. That's a peculiarly European innovation. But they've managed to substitute the governmental form for the very fact of nationality itself and refer to us as minority populations or tribal groups. Tribe actually is an animal grouping, and there's no insult in indigenous tradition to that kind of nomenclature, but we're not dealing with indigenous tradition imposing the term. And in European tradition, animal groupings are rather far down the pecking order of significance, humanity, rights, and entitlement. The natural world has no rights at all. And there's a weird irony to that, insofar as in relegating native people to that natural world, they're accurately reflecting our reality, but we're coming from a diametrically opposing valuation of what that means. Truth, by the very semantics of the situation, those of the Western tradition and perspective refer to us as, and unsurprisingly then treat us as, a form of animal life which is readily expendable, which has no rights comparable to their own, which may be interesting, exotic. You may have a humane society for animals as you have a humane society for natives. You may even punish people who are abusive to their livestock, to their pets, and so forth, but we have this nomenclature. To get to the truth aspect that might allow a rearrangement, rearticulation, recreation of relations, if you will, academics, those who shape the nature of the discourse and the meaning of things, have an especially heavy burden and a potentially unique role. They played a very, very important part in disguising the truth to try to turn, as in the literature of alcoholism it's framed, turn the opposite of everything into truth, to hide it, could play as critical a role in bringing it out so it's clearly understood and the parties understand their relative positions, their histories, the basis of the relations that are in need of changing, and consequently the manner in which the relations need to be changed by any reasonable definition. And there is an innate capacity for reason in all people. This is not all malicious. But while we were riding over here from the hotel, I was shown a book which is something of interest and ties to what was being talked about and goes right to this issue, because one of the prime motives in generating this sort of national interest in a cottage industry and implementing truth and reconciliation processes in Canada was an exposure of some of what happened in the residential schools up here. And by the way, that puts you light years ahead of where it is in the U.S., because the only cognition of the residential schools, which they tend to call boarding schools down there, that afflicts or affects the population, whether native or non-native, if you're not directly connected to it in the native community, is how about that Jim Thorpe? One decathlon, one pentathlon, King of Sweden himself called him up on a stage in Stockholm at the Olympics and said, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." And Thorpe responded, "Thanks, King." Wow. Football, athletic prowess, 100 years ago. And if you go beyond that, I mean, people actually believe Carlisle Industrial School somehow or another was that idyllic Harvard-like campus that's depicted in the movie that Thorpe couldn't even appear in, Caspar Lancaster as him. You got this wholly detached view and pervasive ignorance in the States. Things are not good here in terms of knowledge. That is, compared to the States, much better. In the sense of approaching truth. Approaching, not there. Not there. It's official posture of the government of Canada that the G word will not be used in connection with the residential school process. Anybody know what I mean by the G word? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to run through that a little bit. This book I was talking about goes directly there. The title is American Indians, the Irish. Now that's what caught me. There's not been anything that made a comparison there because they sort of pioneered those schools in Ireland. They pioneered a lot of stuff done to the indigenous population here against the Irish. We have more in common in reality than we know, and it's not the superficial kinds of stuff that they try to pass off. It's the experience of colonization on the really sharp end of it. Anyway, American Indians, the Irish, and government schooling. And they're talking about the residential schools, and they're comparing them to schools that were imposed upon the Irish, and comparing the curricula, and comparing the goals and objectives and the methods used and the outcomes. Now, you run around in universities and you study in anthropology departments whether there might not be something intrinsic to indigenous cultures that predisposes people newly exposed to alcohol to alcoholism. Is there a cultural defect of some sort? And you've got people out there being funded by the government to do scientific research in labs to see if there's some quirk of DNA. And they've actually got a bunch of Native people convinced that there is a DNA characteristic that predisposes them to alcoholism. Has nothing to do with concrete circumstance. Has to do with your DNA. There's something about you that causes this to happen. And I'm saying to myself, well, if it's culture, how is it then that we share so much in common culturally with the Irish? I don't know that I can speak a single word of Gaelic. And I understand the music to be half Arabic, and I'm not talking about Arabs here. Okay? But you're telling me North American indigenous cultures have a matrix of cultural dysfunction identical to that of the Irish because we have identical rates of alcoholism? So if you really want to know about Native culture, you want to go over to Ireland and spend a couple, 3 years. And make you a perfect Ojibwe, right? Or DNA. You know that guy with red hair and blue eyes or green eyes or whatever it is a stereotype of the Irish somehow or another is interchangeable at a molecular level with the native North American population. That accounts for alcoholism? Well, I don't think either of those are going to hold up. I would argue that they're academic subterfuges designed to divert attention from the fact that any people that are subjected to the ravages of colonialism as extensively as the Irish and American Indians have been and experienced the trauma both culturally and individually and in families and in communities that comes with that. That if you did that to your average neighborhood in Los Angeles, say Brentwood, for example, a bunch of rich people, if you did that to them to 2 or 3 generations, they'd be acting just exactly the same way, with the same maladies, the same afflictions. That's basic Franz Fanon. The colonized always end up doing this. Instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars studying native DNA to see if you can find a link to predisposition to alcoholism, how about you take the lists of people who were treated for alcoholism, they're incomplete, but you got them, and see if you can do a correlation to the residential schools. People who went through the residential schools ended up being acute alcoholics. See if you can find that correlation. Get your PhD on that and do something useful. Try to hook it back to the reality of the social processes we're aware are there, but deny the consequences of. Turn it into a parody. Well, here's the academic gaming that goes on. And I suspect this is probably a pretty good book. I'm going to find it very useful for what I'm doing. But you always have to take the information, the articulation, reframe it in terms of reality a little bit. Let me read to you. Hope I marked the right page, because if I didn't, oh yes. Page 337, note 30. There is no index entry on this word in the book about what was done to Aboriginal children and Irish children. And it's all children we're dealing with this stuff. By genocide, quote marks around it. Ew. By that word, I'm being extreme, just writing it on a piece of paper here. By genocide in quotes, I mean the actual or attempted, and now we're going to have italics to emphasize, physical extermination of a people. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1951, well actually it's 1948, but that's one of those little academic quibbles. Okay, that convention has a much broader definition than mine. What is, using his dating 1951 or using the real dating 1948 Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide? How would you classify it? A novel? Poem? Well, it was novel in its day, okay? It's now customary law, it's international law, it's black letter law. Law has a rather broader definition, but I don't find that one comfortable and convenient. So I'm going to redefine it for its application here to this context of the function and effect of the residential schools. Okay, then it gives you a little, so you can Google it, one of those HTTP blah blah www, yeah, one of those. So you can look it up then on Google and see what it actually has to say, but the operant definition will be one that has nothing to do with the rule of law. Now, I do understand that legal definitions are not the only definitions of things. And that might be excusable if you could say, well, you know, in its original framing, genocide meant this. And then the law took it in this other direction. And I think the actual meaning of the word, the lay meaning of, rather than the legal meaning, might be applicable here more usefully. But the fact of the matter is that genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to encompass certain aspects of Nazi occupation policy in Europe. He was an exiled Polish Jewish jurist, so this was rather of interest to him. And it was rather broader than the legal definition. So the actual definition certainly is not going to be acceptable to this guy, and the legal definition is a little too broad for his taste too. Let's narrow it down here a bit for our purposes of analysis, academically speaking. This will be scholarship. Let's narrow it down to what it didn't happen. And all the things that were by law defined as genocide that did happen just aren't going to be part of the definition. So we couldn't be guilty of genocide. If it's genocidal what we did, we'll just redefine genocide to the point where it means something other than. Well, this is a scholar who is using a scholarship not to clarify the meaning of accepted terms, but to deform the terms to the point where they don't actually have their meaning when applied to his own social context. And supporting an official process of doing exactly the same thing. I'm going to run through the Genocide Convention with you and toss out some illustrations from the actuality of Euro-Canadian or Euro-American indigenous peoples in history. And what you're going to have under Article 2 are 5 different policy trajectories defined in law as being genocidal, and all 5 of them are going to be applicable. I'm also going to touch a little bit on Lemkin's original definition and what the dilution was and why it was diluted. But I said that what he's doing is reinforcing an official posture on the part of the government of Canada. And the reason he's got 51 in there is because That's when it was put out for ratification by the various member states of the United Nations, and Canada ratified it very early, unlike the United States, which was the only holdout. 40 years after the thing it came into force as law. That's how I want to put that, in 1952. 40 years after that, the United States still was not a valid ratifier. Canada wouldn't have been either, but Canada went in early and got away with some stuff that couldn't be done later. What did Canada do? Well, you find that in the parliamentary debates, the whys of it. But what they did was each ratifying country accepting the convention then has to write a domestic law to implement. And in the Canadian Implementation Statute of 1952, those 5 criteria, the policy trajectories, became 3. They simply deleted 2. Now, the rationalization of that was that certain aspects of the Genocide Convention pertain rather specifically to the late hostilities in Europe, and therefore had no particular application in Canada. So he said. So what did they delete? They deleted the one on mass killing. So what are you saying with that? You're saying that, no, excuse me, you didn't delete the one on mass killing. Deleted 2, retaining mass killing, physical destruction, and forced sterilization. That was the 3 they retained. Yeah? 2 they kicked out would have been the 2 that Canada was doing. I mean, it's safe enough to proscribe Auschwitz-style extermination. Canada wasn't doing that. So it will be illegal in Canada to do what we're not doing. All right? They try to make the physical destruction into things sound like it was a recapitulation of killing. That's a misinterpretation of it, but that's how they were reading it, so basically they outlawed it all over again. Once again, you can't do what we're not doing. And sterilization? Well, apparently they weren't doing that either because they made it illegal to do it. Forced transfer of children was one that they deleted. I think probably just having held up the book in the boarding schools might have a little resonance on that. They were doing that, so that was deleted from being made illegal. And then there was one about imposing severe conditions, physical or mental, upon a target group. Took that one away too. I guess those only pertain to Europe. Well, what they did was they deleted both of the ones that pertain directly to Canada from their understanding of what was prohibited and retained only those things that they weren't doing. And in 1986, they reformed, improved, I guess. That's what reform is supposed to mean. They reformed the act. In its reformed version, now there's only 2. They deleted forced sterilization as well, which sounds to me kind of like, heads up, we weren't doing it before, but we're doing it now. So it's no longer illegal. If we're doing it, it's not illegal. Genocide will be defined for purposes of analysis and the study of the residential schools and their effects, only in such term as it will not fit the Canadian paradigm. Well, here's where I am tonight. I want to make a news flash. I'm going to be kind of like Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity, or get ready, here it comes. Yes, it was genocide, and it still is. And a genocide denied does no more than lay the groundwork psychologically and otherwise. Conceptually, you can tick off the reasons for perpetuation of the genocide and the instigation of additional genocides. That's exactly what that count comes down to. Academics who are playing this game are making the world safe for the perpetration of genocide. No more, no less. If that's comfortable and convenient, then they're part and parcel of the process, and that is not a good position to be in, and it is not an appropriate utilization of the institutions of higher education. In fact, it's not education at all, it's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. That turns the institutional rubric of Canada or the United States, grand universities, intellectual processes, and so forth, into no more, no less than a grand-scale recapitulation of neo-Nazi Holocaust denial. Techniques are the same, the intent's the same, they're simply defending another group of people than the Nazis, and perhaps that's fair at some level or another. One does not defend Nazis. But on the other hand, the Nazis were not alone, and that's the real important part of the lesson to be drawn from Nazism. So let's run through this. Let's run through this. Article 2 of the 1948 Convention holds that genocide will be understood as any policy undertaken with intent to bring about the destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Note, right off the bat, genocide is not about defining the fate of individuals. It's about defining the fate of target groups, the group. You could theoretically have a genocide perpetrated in Lemkin's view, and the framing of this, and if you think about it, the way they just put that in law is the same thing. You could theoretically, hypothetically, have a genocide perpetrated, consummated, without killing a single individual. No one has to die. It is not a synonym for killing, mass or otherwise. There is no scale, no proportionality, no mode, nothing like that pertaining to killing that is definitive of genocide. He's constrained it entirely to physical extermination. In fact, Lemkin, when he initially framed that, likened what he meant by genocide to what had previously been called denationalization. They strip you of your identity in terms of your nationality, your culture, your affinity. So you no longer can function as a part of a group in the world. That could be accomplished, genocide was accomplished on certain occasions by killing. Denationalization did not admit to the possibility of killing. That's something, a different category from denationalization. Because you could accomplish what he was talking about through killing. You didn't have to, but you could. New word. But denationalization, in and of itself, points much more strongly toward cultural emulsification than it does physical eradication. And that's in the conception of the term. To talk about defining it the way this guy is utterly void the meaning of the term. It no longer means what it meant at all. Period. To shake it down to a paraphrase, as Lemkin defined it, genocide means any process undertaken with the intent to bring about the dissolution and ultimate disappearance of a targeted group. Any process that dissolves the group. So you've got that little enunciation of protected classes, as they're called in the Genocide Convention, and incidentally, indigenous people meet all four of the criteria. We are national groups, and we've got the treaties to prove it. We're recognized as such. Whether any other criteria could be brought to bear. We've been formally recognized, and it's required that we be considered recognized as such under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. All right, that again is international. That's the law. National, ethnic, that's our cultures. Our cultures are not the same. We have culture, we have ethnicity. We can all be Aboriginal people, but have a multiplicity of ethnicities, culturally defined. We certainly have a spiritual tradition, that's what they mean by religion, that is observable. Whether it's comprehensible to non-indigenous peoples, another story entirely. They do recognize that it's there. They make funny little movies and sweat lodge kits and New Age literature and everything else as a result of it, so you can't say they don't know that. And they define us by race. We, in no language that I'm aware of, there may be some that I'm not aware of. There's a lot of indigenous languages out there, and I don't purport to universal knowledge of them, but in no indigenous language that I know of is there a word for race. But the people who wrote the law define us as being a race. Actually, as they define race, there's 3 different racial stocks at least composing the Aboriginal population of the Americas. So we'd have 3 races, all Aboriginal, but they define us as a race, kind of like they define North America as beginning at the Rio Grande and going up and including Greenland. Really interesting way of looking at geographical reality, but it conforms to political interest and political need. Okay. If policy devolves upon killing members of the group by virtue of their group membership, it's genocidal. A lynching, for example, in the American South, where Klansmen came and grabbed the most convenient and vulnerable black man they could find standing on a corner, took him out, mutilated him, burned him, and hanged him from a tree as a message to the black community. No other reason than because he was black. That's not just murder, it's a genocidal act. Remember, it said in whole or in part, and it's no more specific than that. Theoretically, just on a strict construction of the law, a single incident of that could trigger prosecution for genocide. You don't have to kill 50 people that way, or 500, or 5. There's no set number, nor is there a proportion on the community. If you're killing by that pattern, it's genocidal killing, and it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 1,000,000. Okay? Well, you got enough of that in Canada to qualify. You got a lot of that in the States. The histories are different north and south of the line. Quantitatively, not qualitatively. Only killing a few people by disease-infected blankets, or a few people by military action, or a few people relative to what the United States was doing does not exonerate Canada. It just makes the United States the better example of that particular genocidal mode. Better example, not the only example. The second, and this ought to knock people off the idea that killing has to be involved, although it can be a collateral effect. None of these modes end up not generating bodies, and that's why I said hypothetically you could have a genocide free of killing. You can make people desperate enough they do themselves in. You can do it by design, by policy. They're just as dead and you're just as responsible, and that's what they said at Nuremberg, and they were right. They just didn't apply those principles to themselves. Okay. The second of the policy trajectories that are delineated under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention is systematically creating conditions that bring serious physical or mental, by which they mean psychological harm, to the members of the target group. And the idea being to make them so uncomfortable by remaining identified with the group that they'll try to voluntarily separate themselves and become something else. That initiates a process of group dissolution, and the object is always that the group go out of existence in the end. Now, theoretically, on that one, you could have everybody survive. They won't be who they started out being, and a group will no longer exist, and that's the genocidal result. Third is to create conditions leading to the physical destruction of the group. That's the one Canada and a lot of scholars in the U.S. as well try to argue is a recapitulation of killing. Physical destruction, after all. No, that's not what they're talking about. They already said killing. They used a whole word. Okay? Took one word to say that. Didn't mean that they go down 2 lines and use a whole sentence to say the same thing. But if you got a group that's a land-based people, for example, what happens if, like at Big Mountain in Arizona, they bring in the Peabody Coal Corporation, drag lines, and strip mine the entire surface of the land that the people take their identity from? Where do they go when that's happening? Well, what happened at Big Mountain is they relocated them to Flagstaff, Phoenix, and Tucson, and San Diego, relocated into Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, and Seattle, and Denver, and Minneapolis, and Chicago. And exactly where's the group again? How do they retain cohesion and identity when they're scattered across an entire continent? You can't argue that they're going to be able to reconstitute themselves at some future date once the dominant society is done with the extraction process, because the land itself is gone. It's been strip mined now 150 feet deep. That area that gave them identity, meaning to their organization and being, no longer exists. Or how about what they had in mind up there at Gray Whale? Going to put an area the size of Western Europe under 200 feet of water on average to generate hydroelectricity they didn't have a use for. So where were the James Bay Cree supposed to go? Well, they had that all worked out too. That's just two examples. We can keep ticking them off. Where exactly are the people in northern Saskatchewan supposed to go once the uranium is all out of the ground? And now about what they do with the uranium. Okay, those reactors generate plutonium. You know, 1 pound of plutonium, 1 pound of plutonium in the atmosphere, if you could distribute it equally around the surface of the earth, would kill every mammal on it. 1 pound. There's 4,000 pounds missing from U.S. inventories right now. You expose that stuff to air, it atomizes. It's only a theoretical possibility that you can make an even distribution of it once it atomizes. This 1 pound of plutonium I'm holding here, which is actually, if it's plutonium, it's burning a hole through my hand. It ignites on contact with air. Okay? There's 4,000 pounds missing. Oh yeah, all the lung cancer epidemic in North America, that's all your own social habits. Okay, let's slap a bunch of no smoking signs up and pretend that that's what it was about. Never been a death from plutonium inhalation. We can't account for 4,000 times the amount it would take to kill all the mammal life on Earth, and it's running around now, and our thing is to blame smoking and mine more uranium, because if you know what the plutonium is doing to you, you might just resist on that basis alone bringing the uranium out of the ground. But since it's only a bunch of moose and indigenous people up there, yeah. Okay, that's what the physical destruction's about. Sterilization? Well, I don't have the data on up here, but I do know that down in the States, the Indian Health Service, so-called, managed to sterilize something a little over 40% of all Native women of childbearing age in the 1970s. Involuntary and often unwitting sterilizations, and then, of course, you got the forced transfer of children. But let's back up to the sterilizations again. This whole thing is you're supposed to drive a people biologically out of existence, right? That's the whole fetish about you got to kill them, otherwise they might still be there and they could blah, blah, blah. The culture might come back. This is kind of like Hitler and Himmler talking about the bacilli of the Jews, you know, like a form of germ life that if we're not completely eradicated, might come back. Well, let's just say you take a people the size of, Havasu. Let's say I'm a policymaker in Arizona and I want to make a particular disposition for a golf course at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Havasu's only 350 odd people. Pretty easy to conceive of sterilizing all of them. Now, by the definitions used, they're going to go biologically out of existence just as surely at the end of a single generation. Those who are alive, childbearing age or younger, if you sterilize them at the end of the current generation of young people, there will be no more Havasu, just as surely as if you'd stood them all up against the canyon wall and shot their brains out. But if you take this physical extermination definition that's slid in here sounding so reasonable, that wouldn't be genocidal. It would be something else. The residential schools were not a tragedy, they were a policy. The residential schools and what was done with them, it was done with genocidal intent. And from what I see, Main Street in Winnipeg and Vancouver, and on the reserves. It doesn't have to be complete. It's had a genocidal impact, and it's continuing to have a genocidal impact. And a part of the continuation of the genocidal impact is the denial by the dominant society that the genocide was genocidal. Ask the Jews about the effect of Holocaust denial. It's traumatic. It replicates, it re-wounds. It spreads the trauma. The trauma is the basis for alcoholism, suicide, truncated lifespan, fragmentation of families. Repetitively traumatized people work that way. It doesn't matter what community, what culture, what complexion they happen to be, these effects are present. It's just that it's endemic in Native society, and it's endemic because you had national policies geared to generate it. It was to destroy Native people. That was a stated intent in Parliament, and it was also the stated intent in the Ministry of Northern Affairs. So here, let's get to the truth of it, cognate it, suck it up, take it for what it means, redefine your relationship to the other on the basis of accepting responsibility for your position in the terms of how you got to have it, whether you're on one side or the other. Stop pretending the opposite of everything is true, because it's too unpleasant to confront if you're the victim, and even more unpleasant to confront if you're the beneficiary of the victimization. Let's get to that truth. Let's get to the understanding that the kind of truth we're talking about is a wounding kind of truth. Native people and Native societies are not sick, they are wounded. There's a difference between being sick and being wounded. And don't tell me about reconciling with somebody stuck a knife in your guts and while he's still twisting it, we're going to start to make friends. No, first maybe you pull the knife out. That's the truth part. You start actually making amends that are consequential, meaningful amends, like you understand responsibility in this world as a human being for the effects of what's been done in your name. Let's not be arguing that a person being wounded has a responsibility to reconcile, because what is it that Euro-Canada has to reconcile with Native Canada about? Native Canada never did a damn thing to Euro-Canada. Nothing. Nothing tangible at all. It's all one way. It's all the people on the receiving end. The people with the figurative knife in their guts are supposed to take the initiative to reconcile. They're supposed to be willing to do that to the torturer who's still playing with a knife, or the rapist. You tell a woman to start reconciling with her rapist while the rape is going on. If that sounds absurd, understand it's no more absurd than what's being promoted here as a solution to the history of the relations and the evolution of those relations in Canada or the United States. That's my reflections on this. Healing does not begin till wounding stops. Psychologically, healing does not commence until that form of wounding stops either. It is an utterly idiotic, at best, expectation that either can occur while the process of maintaining the status quo remains in place. It's more than apology necessary. It's acting upon what it is that's being apologized for. Whatever you did wrong, you got to make right, and that's not by pretending it's something other than what it was. So this goes to the expectations of Native people. It also goes to the behavior to be expected of settlers in Canada and the United States. But I'm in Canada, so I keep emphasizing Canada. And with that, I think I'm probably going to stand down. And I'll also probably talk longer than I meant to, but let's get into hearing why I'm wrong and all the rest of that, okay? No speeches would be in order because time would be fairly short. Questions or comments would be another story. Spit wads would be okay. If you want to do brick bats, we go out in a parking lot and see who wins that one, but not in here, okay? Mitakuye, thank you for listening. Yeah, well, been out of the way.
We have microphones in each the two aisles here. I also want to mention that Professor Churchill will sign books at the end of the question and answer period. Thank you very much. And the questions, please.
Let me do a little truth in advertising that last part. If you want books, get the books. And I'll come back in from smoking my cigarette, which I will do immediately after shutting down here, and sign them all. How's that? Okay. The elite will meet for a smoke outside on the street immediately after the Q&A, comments, spit wads, etc. So, fire when ready.
Is that me?
I guess that's you.
There. I'm just wondering if you could clarify your understanding of the rights and responsibilities of servant class settlers to Aboriginal people, people who were brought here against their will, and people who were compelled to come here based on their poverty, and who were often victimized very brutally themselves by the dominant class.
Okay. Well, by analogy, little story or whatever, we used to have a lawyer, John Thorne, who was actually once upon a time George Jackson's lawyer, part of the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee. He was of Norse descent. And we were sitting around in the office one day, and John looked at Russell Means and he said, "Russ, you know what? I'm not like these other honkies." Russ looked at him the way he does, didn't say a word, just looked at him, waited. He says, "My guys came over here 500 years before Columbus, saw the place was occupied and went home." He looked all kinds of smug and proud of himself, and Russ looked at him as Russ does and says, "Yeah, John, but they came back, didn't they?" Just rained on the parade. And then it's not that any group on any scale is homogeneous. There's differences. And I would not deny your class differences and oppression in background. Question how you want to act on that. We have a common oppressor, you know. You're going to align with the oppressor, you're going to align with the oppressed. Because your period of oppression, as you were defining it, is over. Doesn't mean there's no oppressed white folk in Canada. But now who are they going to line up with? See, comes down to that. And that's the truth part. Who's your friends? If you're friends with those guys in Ottawa, you're the enemy. That's your choice to make. You can understand the history, but you also got choices to make. That's true for Native people too. We've been indoctrinated and processed for generations. We can be our own worst enemy. That's the object of those processes and procedures. And everywhere British colonialism or any other kind of colonialism I know of, but particularly British colonialism when it did the same thing. Read Kipling's Gunga Din. You're going to meet a whole people who may even be your relatives. I know there's some of mine. What's Gunga Din about? A guy that was valorized in British literature for the fact that he went out and saved British lancers going after his own people at the expense of his own life, and not only saved the lancers, but basically precipitated the defeat of his people who were in a position to resist. Hey, if you're the colonizer's hero, you're the enemy of the colonized, and it doesn't matter what color you are. We understand our history in order to empower ourselves to make an effective opposition now. That's the purpose. It's not an abstract exercise. So, what I say about that is, it's not a gene code. You can be accepted and affect the reconciliation on personal terms by your own conduct, the way you carry yourself in the world. Okay? Gives you the option. I guess it's fair to go back and forth, so.
Hello. My name is Paulette Putra. I'm from Muscopine First Nation. I go to school and university. It's my third year. I'm Dakota Cree. My name is O'Neill Wakawi, and I'm welcoming you. Thank you for giving those kind words, and more importantly, opening our ears to the truth of and actually seeing the reality of what's going on within our own societies. I'm very aware of your standings as a previous professor. And
Yes.
you spoke at the First Nations University earlier, and I never got to ask you a question. But I wrote down in best form way that I could possibly put it down in words. But try not to be offended, as I wouldn't be offended with your answer. How do you feel about the institutions such as the university that you worked at, using you just like Leonard Peltier as an example, speaking the truth and how the United States government ways of operating and the rights of First Nation people by stripping you from your title as being a professor for 10 plus odd years plus?
Very
Not
blessed.
on just a small level of media, but by mass, by setting precedents with you, showing us what we got to look forward to by speaking academic freedom rights. And what can you offer us as the foundation? Because already you guys set this, you guys are founding fathers of what we are facing as Aboriginal people, not only in Canada, but on a world mass, Indigenous people. What can you offer us as you youth, as foundation for our children and our children's children, to look generations beyond here? How can you help us in ways of telling us how to look forward for our people, how to stand strong and be academic and be able to speak freedom rights? Because that doesn't only affect us as Indigenous Aboriginal people, but affects everybody on a mass media. You can't be academic and speak your freedom rights and be able to voice your opinions and have an opinion without being beyond that government position. How can you offer information to us? Thank you.
It's a good question. And I give you the only answer I know, because it's the one I live by. I don't live by somebody else's. And in a way, that is the answer. Whether it's to be academic, whatever that means, or to be something else, anything else, the fundamental decision you've got to make, and this is the one traditionally we always had to make, is who you were to be, not what it was you were to do. If you get that answer, then what you do comes right out of who you are. And the University of Colorado and that professorship was a tool. Wasn't who I was. I was never wedded to it, and that was shocking to them. Still is shocking to them, as a matter of fact. I was doing what I do before I was a professor at the University of Colorado, and I think if anybody's been paying attention, stayed awake at all tonight, you know I'm still doing it. I did it there as long as it was convenient, useful, a good base to work from, and when it stopped being that, I kept right on doing what I do. I won't compromise what I do in order to have the accommodation of a title or an office, and there's no reason for you to either. See, there is life outside of that, and it is intellectual life. It was not that long ago, even in a dominant society, that most intellectual life happened outside of the institutions. The institutions have systematically attempted to monopolize that. I got no problem with taking it back out. Even though I'm speaking in a university, I'm not speaking from the base of a university. And if a university offers me something consistent with what I do, I might consider being in one again. But I am not drooling, chomping at the bit, desperate for it. See, what I always try to teach my students, because some people, it may come as a shock, but I didn't really start this. People of my generation didn't either. I learned from Vine and Bob Thomas and George Manuel and people who were a generation before me, and they had learned from others, and we're continuing that almost in spite of the institutions. Our purpose is to transform the institutions insofar as we relate to them at all. If we can't do that, then we shouldn't be here, okay? But what it was that I was taught and tried to transmit was learn to read between the lines, okay? That's what I got to say to all your prestige and your honors and your security and your blah, 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 because they can talk endlessly into eternity for no one to hear. The point is to make people hear you, learn from it, and act on it. If I can do it at a street rally, I'll do it there. If I do it in a reserve, a village and reserve, in northern Canada, I'll do it there. If I do it having a shouting match with Sean Hannity on his ground, I'll do that too. It's okay. You do it all. But know who you are, where you're coming from, and what you're trying to do. If you stay consistent with that, if you have the integrity of your own sense of self, then you're fine. And I'd say that to anybody who asks. I'd even say it to professors who think they know better. Okay? Because unfortunately for that little girl that's exposed in the front of New York Times for having charged $1,000 an hour to the governor of New York or whatever that was, that's not the only kind of prostitute around. And when I want to see real prostitutes, I usually go to a university and attend a faculty member meeting.
Oh. Okay. This is Daniel Porters. I'm a Métis.
Oh.
I was here last night to listen to Carol Off tell us how we as Canadians are, we have to start thinking about a new story, a new myth. And I just need a comment from you on that, like whether, is it time to let them forget about the old myth, right? The myth that we sort of bought into signing treaties, those of us that were part of the treaty signing process, right? The myth. And now they'd like to forget the myth that they fed. Let's start something new, okay? Let's become warriors that go over and oppress people in Afghanistan like we oppressed our own Aboriginal people.
Yeah, well, they've been working on that, and some of us have bought into it. But first of all, the packaging as myth is just a way of conveying truth in a palatable form. I call it truth. All right? You want myth of the other variety? Well, they're trying them out about every 10 or 20 minutes on CNN or Fox News or CNBC, so you can tie into that kind of mythology, but you may notice that they keep changing, and it's kind of like that truth. Scientific truth is supposedly superior, and I keep asking how come it keeps changing then? What I learned from my elders is just as true now as it was when they told it to me. They'd learn from, and we can keep tracing them back. If it's true, it doesn't change. If it changes all the time, it's not true. Simple. I think we got two different understandings of the meaning of myth here. I may take something I want to teach my children or the children in the neighborhood and tell it as a story. And the story is not literally true. I'm making people up and events up to illustrate a point. But the truth is what's contained in the story, not the story itself. And that's the way myth works. But I'd say there's a diametrical opposition. What's being put out as we need this new myth is that we need to buy into this game of we make falsehood believable by telling a good story about it. I'm not willing to go there. So I guess I'd have to disagree with that. Otherwise, we're going back and looking for ways of telling the same truths that we learned in ways that make sense to people in a context that may have shifted a bit. Still the same story. You can, and I've seen it done, you can take Greek mythology, I don't see them doing that much with native stuff, and I haven't seen that much native stuff done by native people yet. Could be done the same way. Greek mythology can be repackaged in terms that have the setting in downtown New York 20 minutes ago. Same story. Okay? And that was the purpose of the mythology then. It's mutated. Everybody is indigenous somewhere. Everybody has a tradition somewhere. Everybody has a mythos in the sense we're talking about it somewhere. That's why I went off to the Greeks, not because I'm all fascinated with the West. If we know those truths, that'll help with knowing who we are as people. Peoples and people. Embrace that. Tell yourself whatever story you need to tell yourself to make that truth understandable, comprehensible, something you can live by. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that was my best shot at it. I think you're going to be the last one because I think I'm beginning to border on incoherence now. When that happens, I start to sound like George Bush and probably, okay.
You're a lot better than that. My name is Sheree Mestasha. I'm Métis and Romanian. I was born in Regina, Saskatchewan. My mother moved me to BC when I was 9 years old, so I was raised in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver. I moved back here 4 years ago so that I could get back in touch with my ancestors, because this is where I identify more with my Métis side. So one of the things that I found the most difficult since moving to Saskatchewan is there isn't a lot of talk about decolonization or sovereignty. There's talk about traditionalism and stuff like that, but I'm not really sure what traditionalism means. I don't have a lot of trust or faith in it because I feel that has been colonized and recreated. So I want to know where I can find some more educational tools on the process of decolonizing.
More educational tools in the process of decolonization? Oh my God, there's a whole vast literature on that out there. I don't know whether you're talking about conceptual tools or more concrete forms of tools, okay? Means concrete? Well, target practice. Shouldn't be too hard to do around here. I've never known of a colonizer that willingly gave up a colony anywhere ever, and I've never known of a nonviolent process anywhere ever, and that does most definitely include India. Okay? So, if you're actually going in that direction, there's some preconditions that have to be there, but you need the fundamental skills to have parity. Simple. And that's a psychological thing in part too. Now, that might be completely different up here. I don't spend a lot of time in Saskatchewan, but I spend a fair amount of time among people of, well, cynically in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado, we called it 4 major food groups, which were brown people, red people, yellow people, and black people. Okay. All of whom had being counted and represented in the university's calculus of thing, blah, blah. Okay? They left white people out of that because I think they have ethnicity too. They don't believe they have culture half the time when they walk into a class, but they seem to be speaking the same language, and I thought that was a matrix of culture. In any event, you get all these discontented people in this sort of rainbow spectrum of race and ethnicity out there who want to be revolutionaries, but all of them, well, what they are basically, because of the way you get brought up in the urban context in the United States, unless you're a gangbanger, you're probably technologically intimidated by weapons. Period. That's why I say it's psychologically. They're disempowered. Self-disempowering. State functions primarily on a claim to legitimate monopolization of violence. And that's exactly what disarming yourself in the face of an armed state is about. You're doing the job for them. You're not going to decolonize under those situations. I'm not simply saying go out and pop a bunch of caps on Saturday afternoon at a bunch of targets, call it good. You're not doing whatever they got for wood lore up here, okay? It's part of a broader process, but without that psychological core to it, the decolonization process is not going to work. And if you want the conceptual tools to go to that one, I recommend a book called Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Okay? Simple. But that was a really tough and open-ended question to ask for the last question of the night.
I was wondering
So-
maybe one last question by any chance?
All right, one last question by any chance, but make it easier than that one because I didn't give an adequate answer to it, and I don't know that I'm
Okay,
capable.
I'll try to make it easy. If there was an answer to ending the poverty, the genocide, the indoctrination, if it was an all-encompassing answer, if you could put that in maybe even like 2 sentences, if you could, how about this? If it was a headline
Do
on
you
a
now or
newspaper.
have you ever worked for a Canadian intelligence agency? Maybe a U.S. infiltrator of some sort.
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
Let me tell it to you this way, all right? This is the multicultural answer. Fits everybody. Different ways perhaps, but everybody nonetheless, all right? Change is not going to come by virtue of a pill. If there was a pill that would accomplish that, we all took it in the 1960s, and I can tell you it didn't work. All right? Change is not going to come by music. Ask Pete Townsend, he can't hear his own music anymore. Stone deaf. Music is not the revolution, but it might be a nice accompaniment, and it probably will be televised, but the televising is not going to affect the change either. You're not going to be able to frame a moral argument to people you consider to be absolutely immoral in what they are doing and be successful. That in and of itself is not going to work. Neither is holding the right rally, getting the right number of people to march down the street, holding the requisite form of candles, burning the right incense, changing diets, changing hairstyles, changing attire. It doesn't matter whether you're wearing, well, you were wearing a pretty nice, I hadn't seen one of those things since the 1960s either, tie-dyed t-shirt or all black, okay? In fact, black can be a liability. If you're going to be a black blocker and go out and do battle with the police, you might want to ditch the uniform that identifies who you are. Leave that to the cops, okay? None of these little fetishes is going to do it. Their statements, they may be empowering, they may allow for organizing, they may do this, that, and the other thing, alternative radio stations, blogging, writing books, making speeches, those all go towards another end, okay? Here's what the end is. And I'll frame it in terms of the U.S. because that's usually where I'm talking, but it'll work just as well for Canada, so substitute terms go along. I've been at this for a while, 40 years. Actively as an adult, I guess, although some people would deny that to this day. And when I started out, I had just come back from Vietnam. Well, actually, I had started out before, but got active and engaged. U.S. out of Vietnam, and it spread, and it became U.S. out of Indochina, and it was U.S. out of the Caribbean Basin, and U.S. out of Central America, and U.S. out of Southern Africa, and U.S. out of the Gulf region, which is still active, and you can probably add in a few more here and there's that I've overlooked, but you get the drift, and I agree with every single one of those, but what I want to see is U.S. out of North America. Okay? That might actually take care of all those others rather than trying always to battle symptoms out there rather than the causes in here, because it's much more safe to express solidarity to people who are in armed struggle to overthrow colonial dominance out in the third world someplace or in the fourth world than it is to actually take it down in the first world from where it originates. Now you can do the music, and you can do the dope, and you can do the diet, and you can do everything else, and you can do all the posturing, and you can be purportedly nonviolent, pacifist, and pure, and absorbing none of the cost and consequence of actually bringing this thing down. And bringing it down is ultimately the goal. That's when you know you win. What works? Anything that works in any given context is acceptable, long framed right. Okay? I'm not arguing to any purity in picking up a gun, and I'm not arguing any purity, which is argued a lot, to the opposite, okay? Both have their application. You use the full continuum and you keep it real clear what you're trying to accomplish, and it's not a better bike path. Okay? That's my best answer. You done?
I just say academic prostitute. I would be so flattered. I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank Dr. Pete. I want to thank Professor Churchill here for us tonight on Sewall Cree land. Thank you all very much.